Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to do something pretty ambitious. We are taking 250 years of incredibly dense, sweeping history and distilling it into a single, structured journey. We're looking at a story that goes from a scrappy little cluster of rebellious colonies all the way to a global superpower that, literally, reshaped the entire modern world.
The United States is a story of relentless ambition and constant contradiction. Actually, let's really hold on to that idea, because we're going to see it pop up time and time again. The most incredible leaps of progress in this country were almost always tethered to some really intense, systemic struggles.
To make sense of all this, we've broken the timeline down into 5 distinct eras. First, the birth of a contradiction. 2, expansion, division, and war. 3, industrial might and global power. 4, paranoia and civil rights. And 5, the modern superpower fractures.
All right, part 1, birth of a contradiction.
It's wild to think about, but the leap from these desperate, literally starving colonies to a unified front happened incredibly fast. In 1607, Jamestown barely survived, and it wasn't on gold, but on Europe's highly lucrative addiction to tobacco. Then, just a bit later, in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived. Fast forward to 1776, and driven by crushing taxes and zero representation in British Parliament, these colonies drafted the Declaration of Independence. And, against absolutely staggering odds, they formally secured their freedom by 1783. 32,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the amount of elite British and Hessian troops, basically a floating city of doom, that George Washington's 10,000 barely trained colonists faced down at Brooklyn Heights. The Americans were outflanked, they were outnumbered, and honestly, they were completely broken in that specific battle. Yet, they somehow endured. With some crucial help from French naval power and weapons, the colonies effectively outlasted an overextended British Empire.
But here is where we hit that core contradiction head-on. On one hand, you've got the founders drafting the soaring ideals of universal liberty. But at the exact same time, they were hardening slave codes. The source material points out this glaring irony. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, while personally owning more than 100 enslaved people. And following uprisings, like Bacon's Rebellion, where poor whites and enslaved blacks actually united against the elites, the laws were deliberately rewritten. They created a strict racial hierarchy, making African slavery lifelong and hereditary. So yes, the revolution wrote liberty right into the country's DNA, but man, there was some serious small print.
Moving right along to part 2, expansion, division, and war.
So, the booming American economy? It was essentially a massive, devastating chain reaction. First, millions of acres of native land were simply seized, violently pushing tens of thousands of people westward in the Trail of Tears. Well, that cleared the way for massive southern plantations to pump out just unprecedented amounts of cotton. That cotton was picked by enslaved people, and it directly fueled the booming textile mills and the rapidly expanding railroads up north.
The big takeaway here is that while this market revolution absolutely created a thriving new middle class, that success was heavily built on the backs of expendable bodies, enslaved people, and destitute factory workers. Slavery wasn't just some isolated Southern quirk. It was a foundational engine for the entire American economy. And you know, this massive moral and economic divide eventually boiled over into the deadliest conflict in American history, the Civil War, which finally ended in 1865 when the Union preserved the nation and ended legalized slavery.
4 million. By the time we hit 1870, there were roughly 4 million Black Americans looking to finally experience that freedom they were promised. But the assassination of Abraham Lincoln plunged everything right back into chaos. Instead of genuine freedom, Southern legislatures pushed through black codes and built the Jim Crow system. They used forced segregation and outright violence to push freed people into a racial caste system that barely looked different from slavery. Meanwhile, poor whites were fed the lie that they were superior just because of their skin color, which conveniently kept both groups divided and impoverished.
Okay, on to part 3, industrial might and global power.
Now what's really fascinating here is how all that staggering Gilded Age wealth back home ended up funding a new, often violent, imperial ambition abroad. You had guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller accumulating fortunes so massive they actually dwarfed the national treasury, all while urban slums were expanding at a terrifying rate. The nation was hurtling into the modern age and deciding to take its manifest destiny overseas. The U.S. seized territories like Guam and Puerto Rico and violently crushed an independence movement in the Philippines. And by the time the dust settled on World War I, America's vast industrial capacity had turned it into the primary creditor for a totally broken Europe. And boom, the pendulum swings wildly again. We go straight from the glittering 1920s, which were completely fueled by jazz, electricity, and the birth of modern PR, selling you the century of the self, right into the brick wall of the Great Depression. Rampant speculation and barely regulated banks triggered the catastrophic 1929 Wall Street crash. Millions of shares were dumped in a single day, banks completely failed, and in some industrial cities, unemployment actually soared to 50%. All that shiny early 20th century optimism just completely dissolved into extreme, grinding hardship.
Which brings us to part 4, paranoia and civil rights. Just look at how fast things accelerate here. Within a single breathless decade, America ended a depression, defeated fascism, dropped the atomic bomb, and immediately entered a global standoff with communism. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor flipped American public opinion literally overnight, dragging the country into World War II. American industry roared back to life, saving the economy and supplying the Allies. But dropping that atomic bomb, it changed humanity forever. By 1950, the nuclear arms race was officially on, and the US was already locked in a catastrophic police action in Korea to halt Soviet influence.
And bam! That contradiction theme strikes again, right? You've got this dazzling post-war boom of suburban homeownership, but it explicitly excluded Black Americans through redlining. Hollywood is out there selling the white picket fence dream, rock and roll is promising an endless prosperous America, and by 1960, a crazy 60% of people owned homes. But on the flip side, banks were drawing literal red lines on maps to deny loans to Black Americans who were fleeing the Jim Crow South. This deliberately created underfunded, highly segregated neighborhoods that just deepens systemic inequality for generations.
But if you look beneath that sunny, optimistic surface of the 50s and the civil rights victories in the 60s, the government was pulling off stuff straight out of a Cold War spy thriller. The CIA was busy overthrowing foreign governments in Iran and Guatemala just to protect corporate interests. They even blitzed thousands of Americans with LSD in the MK Ultra mind control experiments to see if they can engineer an assassin. I mean, you can't make this up. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was illegally wiretapping and smearing civil rights leaders. Following the assassinations of JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., and RFK, the entire nation was plunged into this deep, dark era of doubt.
Finally, we reach part 5, the modern superpower fractures.
Modern America is basically a story of severe whiplash. Back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan promised a return to optimism through massive tax cuts and deregulation. And yeah, the economy boomed for a lot of people. But critics are quick to point out that the national debt tripled, inequality widened, and blue-collar wages totally stalled out. When the Cold War ended in 1990, America looked completely invincible. But then came the horrific shock of 9/11. That tragedy completely rewrote the 21st century, launching sweeping wars in the Middle East, which were then rapidly followed by the worst financial crash since the Great Depression.
$8 trillion. I mean, that number is almost hard to wrap your head around, right? It's the estimated cost of the war on terror. The source outlines how conflicts like the Iraq War, which were launched on claims of weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be completely false, resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties and essentially ushered in a whole new era of mass surveillance. As insurgencies grew and chaos spread, the American public's skepticism about the true motivations behind U.S. dominance in the Middle East just absolutely skyrocketed.
So today, even though it's still a total global economic powerhouse, modern America is battling a huge crisis of faith. We're seeing staggering economic inequality, social media algorithms that literally reward outrage over nuance, and a profound bipartisan distrust in the establishment. The 2008 recession alone cost nearly 9 million jobs. You add to that the COVID-19 pandemic, which triggered the largest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in modern history, and bizarre elite scandals involving figures like Jeffrey Epstein, and it's no wonder public cynicism has been pushed into absolute overdrive.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. After 250 years of incredibly messy history, widening wealth gaps, and algorithm-driven polarization, are Americans still chasing those very first ideals? Fairness, freedom, a real share in the spoils? It's a story of a nation that was never perfect, but one that is always relentlessly reinventing itself. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the history that brought us all here.